Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back, welcome back. I hope you've had a wonderful lunch break and a brilliant afternoon exploring climate change, better homes ahead, and raising living standards. There were some excellent events that have been going on during the course of the afternoon, but it's good to be back here together again for this second. We're spoiling you, sir, aren't we? Not one, but two keynotes, people. That's what you get at Fabian Conference. So here we are with our afternoon keynote. What a delight. So for this afternoon's keynote, we are super glad to be welcoming our long-term collaborator and supporter, the previous leader of Lambeth Council. I've just heard he first became a councillor 30 years ago. What a lifetime of commitment to the Labour movement. But now been an MP for what is now Streatham and Croydon North for the last 12 years. And most recently, following the historic Labour victory in July this year. Come on, I know it's like quarter to four. Let's do that again. Following the historic Labour victory in July this year. There we go. He has become the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So please give a big, warm Fabian welcome to Steve Reed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and it's fantastic to be back at the Fabians, and for the first time in a long time, thank goodness, with the Labour government. So many of our earliest memories are about exploring the great outdoors. As a kid, I loved splashing about in the waves on a beach, watching the fish and the crabs move around a rock pool down in Cornwall, climbing trees in the woods at the end of the road where I lived, or just watching the birds and the butterflies in the garden at home. These are the memories of childhood. They help shape who we are, and they instill in us our love of the great outdoors. If you ask people what makes them most proud to be British, our beautiful countryside is second only to the NHS. Our landscape of tumbling hedgerows, edging a patchwork of fields, is integral to our national identity. We are fortunate to live in one of the most beautiful countries on earth. This green and pleasant land, celebrated in poetry and in song, a shared inheritance, a shared identity, a shared belonging. But that inheritance is under threat. After 14 years of the Conservatives, Britain is one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since the 1930s. A quarter of our mammal species and half our bird species are at risk of extinction. Our pollinators, bees and butterflies, are vanishing, putting entire ecosystems at risk. You'll remember Cameron told voters to vote blue, go green, but instead he gave them brown, as our rivers, lakes and seas filled up with record levels of sewage dumping. This is a story of loss, affecting the natural world all around us. And we human beings are not mere observers of nature, we are an integral part of it, and its destruction is ultimately our destruction. But decline is not inevitable. We can change it, and there is no change we need that's more fundamental than the restoration of nature. Now, the things that people care about the most are the things that are closest to home: family, work, community. That includes the natural environment people see from their own doorstep. The parks, green spaces or woodlands close to home make us feel proud of our local area. In polling, this ranks higher than a good local high street, shops or even pubs. It's not the grand political strategies that persuade people things are going right or wrong. It's what they see on their street, in their town or in the environment all around them. People care about what's local because it's what they see every day. It shapes their sense of who they are, where they belong, and their sense of worth. This politics of place is where politics begins. And if we don't root our politics in people's everyday experience, we lose them. The great global challenges, climate and nature, globalization, automation, population movements, can feel threatening and too big to change. They make people fear for the future, and people who fear the future are more likely to cling to the past, creating a politics of nostalgia that looks backwards. People feel much more confident if they can help shape that future for themselves, and that means acting locally to tackle the big challenges that otherwise feel too resistant to change. In my South London constituency, the community's taken over a park called the Rookery down in Streatham, and they've brought in new funding, volunteers and activities that have dramatically improved how it looks and how many people get out there and enjoy it. In Oxfordshire, Phil and Fee, who I met just a couple of weeks ago, have switched their farm to more nature-positive ways of farming and joined a group of other farmers doing the same thing to support each other through the transition. The Purple Horizons project is restoring heathland, wetlands and wildlife habitats on the fringes of the Great West Midlands conurbation, involving local communities and landowners to create beautiful wild green space for everyone to enjoy. Local action and visible proof of change demonstrate the agenda we are pursuing, and it lets local people influence the way that change happens. It's an approach that's applicable way beyond environmental projects. It helps rebuild trust in politics, respects the politics of place, and tackles the grievance that otherwise fuels the political extremes. Politics simply can't be top-down anymore. That's why the work that Angela Rayner and Jim McMahon are leading on devolution and localisation is so important to our project, because we have to get power out of Westminster and into the hands of people in their own communities so they can use it to shape their own destinies. The local environment has a major impact on how people feel about their neighbourhood. We see more litter on our streets and fewer birds in our gardens, and we're left wondering what will remain for our children and grandchildren if we let this go on. But change has begun. Central to the plan for change, our party will restore the natural world that has been in retreat for so long. We are the conservers now, not the Conservatives. Labour's had to clean up the Tories' mess many times in our history, but never perhaps quite as literally as with the sewage scandal. Sewage poured into our rivers, lakes and seas for 3.6 million hours in 2023 alone. This had a catastrophic impact on habitats and wildlife, on businesses and tourism, and on human health. Rowers in the Oxford and Cambridge boat race last year were vomiting before the race began because polluted river water had made them sick. The Conservatives weakened regulation and then stood back as water companies funneled customers' money into multi-million-pound bonuses and dividends instead of fixing our crumbling sewage system. This government will end the sewage scandal. Consumer bills will be ring-fenced, so money earmarked for fixing broken pipes and outlets can never again be siphoned off for bosses' bonuses or shareholder payouts. Legislation that's going through Parliament right now will ban the multi-million-pound bonuses water bosses paid themselves for overseeing catastrophic failure. And bosses who cover up what's going on will face personal criminal charges, including potential jail time. And we'll power up the regulator with more staff and give them the teeth they need to prosecute the polluters, and it'll be paid for by the polluters themselves, not by bill payers. I've appointed Sir John Cunliffe, the former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, to lead a water commission that will report back to me this summer on how we fundamentally reform regulation and how the entire water sector works so the Tory sewage scandal can never happen again. The work to fix our broken water system begins immediately, with over £104 billion of private sector investment starting this April to build the reservoirs and pipes to power change, cleaning up our rivers, providing water for new homes, data centres and gigafactories, creating good, well-paid jobs in every part of this country. As part of our plan for change, this Labour government will clean up our rivers, lakes and seas for good. Now, hard to believe this, but I've been an MP now for 12 years, and an MP and a councillor for quite a few years before that too. And whenever I've surveyed my local residents on what's worrying them, litter and fly tipping come right near the top. And if it matters to them, then it matters to us too. The Tories oversaw a 90% increase in fly tipping, with around a third of reported fly tips being small van-sized. This is visible in our cities and in our countryside, with farmers often left to clear up rubbish dumped on their own land at their own expense. We're taking a two-pronged approach to this, tackling the problem at source by reducing waste and punishing fly tippers more severely as a deterrent. We're working towards a fully circular economy where reusing and recycling materials is the norm and not the exception. It's time to end the throwaway society. Companies will be incentivised to reduce packaging by paying a charge to clean up what they've produced if it ends up on the streets. And we will work with business, sector by sector, to reduce and then eliminate their waste. This doesn't just clean up our streets and reduce the need for landfill and incineration, it cuts carbon emissions, creates new jobs, strengthens supply chains and increases business profitability with an economic boost worth over £20 billion every year. This week, Labour MPs voted through a bottle deposit scheme that will give people back money for returning used drinks containers. Less rubbish on our streets, less plastic choking our seas. The Tories voted against it, as always, on the wrong side of history. And from June, we'll ban the single-use plastic vapes that are too often seen littering our high streets. Britain is not a rubbish dump. Britain is not a rubbish dump, and those who think it's acceptable to throw their filth on our streets will join work squads to clean up the mess they've made, and that's just for starters. A politics of place means every neighbourhood must be somewhere to feel proud of. With our plan for change, this Labour government will clean up our streets. Now, there's no food without nature. This government will always back our farmers in the hard work they do to feed our nation. Our farmers have stewarded the land for centuries. The patchwork of fields we recognise as home is a farmed landscape. But in recent decades, we came to see nature and food production in opposition to each other. The truth is, a healthy natural environment is essential to food production. So we will work with farmers as they transition to more nature-positive ways of farming. This is a programme of reform as significant as any other that this government is leading. Our commitment is shown by the £5 billion the Chancellor allocated as the biggest budget for sustainable food production and nature in our country's history. This will support farmers as they move through a transition that will replenish the soil with organic matter so it can grow more food with less need for expensive and polluting artificial fertilizers. Nature will be incorporated into food production so we stop killing pollinators and the birds that depend on them. And healthier land holds more water, so we can reduce the floodwaters we're seeing as climate change causes floods that previously happened only once in a century to become commonplace. We will cut pollutants that run off the fields and into our waterways. We've banned the pesticides that are killing the bees and butterflies that sustain our food system. We'll grow landscapes, forests, peatlands and wetlands that capture carbon and sustain wildlife. We'll support our national parks and our national landscapes to become wilder and greener. And we'll plant 3 new national forests as we restore the woodlands that are the lungs of our planet, inhaling carbon and breathing out clean air. Our countryside is our shared inheritance. That's why we want to open up more of it for people to enjoy responsibly. We made a start this Christmas when we announced saving over 40,000 miles of footpaths and historic rights of way the Tories planned to abandon. And our 9 new national river walks will celebrate the return of life from source to sea as we clean up our polluted waterways. Now, you can't think about farming, thank you. You can't think about farming without considering the wider food system that it underpins. We need to make that system work better for food producers with supply chains that treat them fairly. But we also need the system to work better for consumers so we can reverse the shocking fact that children growing up today are shorter, fatter and sicker than in recent years. Working with Wes Streeting and Bridget Phillipson, we'll introduce a food strategy that will give parents the healthier choices their children need and deserve. Now, economic growth is the primary mission of this government because without it, we can't fund the public services or give people the pay rise they were denied under the Conservatives. Restoring the natural environment underpins that growth. Our Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, is working to end the housing crisis by getting 1.5 million new homes built. We need them desperately. But I'd like to pay tribute to the environmental groups and campaigners we're working with to make sure all that development benefits nature. We are reforming the rules to speed up economic growth, but we will not rip up environmental protections to do it. Housing developers will pay into a new nature restoration fund that will pay for large-scale improvements to habitat, water and air quality, so we are left with more nature in a better condition than before. This is a win-win for the environment and for growth, and it is the approach this government will always take. Where the Tories tried to weaken water pollution rules so house building could go ahead, we will reduce water pollution so we don't need to weaken the protections. In recent decades, the story of the natural environment on these islands has been one of loss. And yet nature underpins all that we are. Without nature, there is no economy, no food, no health, and ultimately, no society. This government will restore the natural world so our children can create the memories that we as adults cherish and enjoy the future that is their birthright. The environmental crisis is not remote and unchangeable. It's there on our streets, in our communities and our green spaces, in our countryside and in our towns. And it's there that change must begin. A politics of place that understands the importance of our environment to who we are. A politics that recognises the pride people have in the places they belong to. A politics that knows we can only rebuild trust by including people, in the decisions that affect them. Our plan for change is the turning point for the environment. Clean rivers, clean streets, clean air, nature in recovery. A story of loss will become a story of hope. This Labour government will restore our environment because it underpins everything else we aim to achieve. Thank you.
Jim, as you read it at the same time. Thank you very much, Steve. And hello, everyone. I'm Chris Smyth. I'm Whitehall Editor at The Times, and I am going to be picking up some of the themes that Steve was talking about there and hopefully discussing how they link to the wider priorities of the government and the future of politics. And I want to start by saying you touched on some big themes there about the nature of England, the nature of the environment, the future of politics, but you also talked about fly tipping. And I think that's interesting because, a big part of your career has been the link between the ultra-local and, what people want from their politicians. And so I just want to start by saying how you see the link between what people think about the future of the country and how they make those big political decisions and what they see and feel when they open their front door and just go out into the streets where they live. There's one on your chair.
I mean, you could have heard some terrible things there. Right. You were spared it. Yes, you're right. I started out as a councillor, a council leader, then an MP, and now I'm in cabinet, so it's been quite a journey. But what I've learned along that path is the local is how people understand what politicians nationally are talking about. And I think all parties, but Labour perhaps more, have a habit of talking about grand strategies, and people don't really understand what that means for their town, their community, their family even. And if we don't interpret it for them and describe it in those ways, it can sometimes miss the mark. I did wonder whether, obviously I haven't been to America recently, I've been watching with fascination what's been going over there, as I'm sure many people in the room have. But the US economy seems to be booming, and yet the Democrats just lost at every single level. And from what I'm reading, and from what people who have been there have said to me, that's at least in part because individual communities and families didn't feel that change in their own pocket. There's no point saying to people things are going well if they don't feel it's going well. So for me, a politics of place is about making those big strategies local so they're meaningful for people. And I think the other reason is we want to rebuild trust in politics. That's partly showing people that what we're doing is relevant to their lives, but also showing people that they can affect politics. And if things feel so big and remote, they're out of reach and you can't change them, people give up. If they're closer to home and local action can make a difference, suddenly they've got a point of connection. And I think that connection is where real politics happens.
And as you say, sometimes on the left there is a tendency to have a politics that sort of floats above the rooftops rather than sort of picking up the bins. But one person obviously who you know very well is Morgan McSweeney, obviously Chief of Staff now at Number 10. He worked for you at Lambeth, and then he sort of made his name, didn't he, for you, and then in Barking, literally thinking, how do we fight the BNP? It's not by organising much, it's by picking up the bins that people are really cross about. I mean, tell us more about how that's quite a concrete example of fighting populism through, quite...
It is, yeah. That was one of the learning experiences for me. So I was leader of Labour in opposition in Lambeth in coming up to the 2006 council elections, and Morgan was my campaign organiser. Turns out he's quite good at that. And we won that election in Lambeth in a year where we lost councils right across the country. There was even a 9% swing against Labour in London, but we won Lambeth by a landslide that year because we focused on the hyper-local. It was about, your local leisure centre, litter on your streets, antisocial behaviour on the local high street. It was the really local things that people cared about, and because we connected with it, when that big swing against Labour in that year happened, it didn't affect us. We went the other way because we were talking about things in a way that people could connect with. A lot of us, we come to fantastic conferences like this, and we enjoy the theory and the concepts of politics. For most people on their doorsteps, they want to know why there's an abandoned vehicle outside their house, why there's a mattress at the end of the road and no one's cleared it out of the way, why there's an increase in drug dealing on the high street, and that's leading to more burglaries and street robberies in the area. Of course people care about that. So we have to interpret the things that we're doing nationally so that they're understandable at a local level, and that is what me and Morgan did in Lambeth and One. It's what Morgan went off to Barking and Dagenham and deployed the same approach against the BNP in that council and saw off the far right. Now, there's a drift towards the right in politics to some extent right now. We see reform rising, and of course we need to work out how to give people confidence in what this government is doing so that we can get elected again at the next election and finish the job. We won't do it if we talk about people, about what we're achieving in ways that goes over their head. We have a much better chance if we can connect change to what people are seeing in their everyday lives because it's relevant.
And talking about the rise of the right, which you've seen in Donald Trump, obviously, which we will talk about, and we've obviously here with Nigel Farage, but across the Western world, how much of that do you think is explicable by the fact that mainstream politicians, centre left, centre right, have not really been talking in ways that are comprehensible to most voters, or just seem to have a completely different set of priorities and interests?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting you say that, because, and I know you're a wordsmith and my background is publishing as well. Language matters in politics, and one of the first times I learned this was 2008, when Ken Livingstone lost the mayoral election in London to Boris Johnson. We commissioned some work after his defeat to see why he had lost, and crime was one of the big issues. The other one was congestion charging, but crime was a very big issue. Boris Johnson was talking about crime in a way that the public talked about crime, criminals. Ken didn't want to talk about crime in that way because he thought it fueled fear of crime, so he talked about policing. But because Boris Johnson's language connected, the fact that Ken Livingstone had introduced neighbourhood policing all over London and it was wildly popular, he still lost because it wasn't the record people voted on, it was the language he was using to describe it. So it's not just doing the right things, it's talking about it in language that people understand. And for me, that's the language that you'd use across, a coffee shop table or the kitchen table or the pub with your mates. It's not some of the language that all of us fall into. When we're giving political speeches. I hope you can't run through my speech just then and find lots of that kind of language in there, but I suspect you can. But we should always all be aware of the need to speak human, not politics.
Which is really interesting, brings you on to, I guess, one of the tensions in the sort of political questions facing the current government, because obviously, the Keir Starmer stresses the priority is delivery, delivery, or in your case, bin collection. Yeah. But there is a question to which how much that means, look, we've got 170-odd majority, we're going to get through it once, so basically we can just go away for 4 or 5 years, focus on that, and then come back and talk to voters, say, look, here you are, you feel better, versus do you actually have to keep talking and explaining to voters in the meantime what you're doing, how it all fits together, and what is the sort of some of the political travails and difficult polling that the government's faced so far a sign of what happens if you can't explain how you are going about that process of delivery?
Of course, you've always got to keep talking and be visible. We've got a 24-hour news media, and if we're not on it, people will assume we've given up and gone home, and you can't allow that to happen. But I think it's not just words that people want. There's growing mistrust in politics. One of the reasons politics has become so volatile is because of that. And people won't believe us just because we say we want to do a thing. They want visible proof points. And what we need to demonstrate to people is tangible change, things that they can appreciate and see are different. And again, that isn't big strategies. What does my high street look like? Is there more rubbish dumped on my local street? Is my local green space in good condition or in bad condition? Is there filth floating down my river, or are there fish swimming down it instead? People look to these things, and they're not going to believe a word we say until we show them that we've made that change. So what we're focusing on in government is not just telling the story of what we're doing. We know we have to show people that change if we want to win the next election, because frankly, the jury will be out until we get there.
Yeah, Which reminds me of how in the 2019 election, there are lots of very excited new Tory MPs wandering around. I remember one of them spoke to me and said, I know I run really because of three reasons. One was Brexit, the other was Jeremy Corbyn, and the third was the state of the high street. And he said, I know I won't have the first two next time around, so I've really got to do something about the state of the high street. Well, he isn't an MP anymore, and his high street's still pretty tatty.
I mean, that feeds into as well, doesn't it? You know, the state of the economy. You know, a growing economy, there's going to be more businesses opening up. That means high streets will be better as well. So, but that's a good example of how the big strategy needs to lead to visible change in the communities that people care about because they are part of them. But back to Biden again. No point at all talking about a growing economy if you then lose the election because people don't see the impact of that in their local area. So I really do think this sense of a politics of place has been there all the way through my political journey, and the more relevant we can make what we talk about to people's everyday lives, the better. And now with digital media, actually, compared to back then, we've got an even better way of targeting our communications in a way that lets people see the change that we've made for them. We've got a record number of MPs around the country. They can be our champions for reinterpreting this story of change into a way that is meaningful for their local community. And a lot of them are really good campaigners because they've fought marginal seats, won them, and they've still got quite slim majorities. They know they need to keep communicating and campaigning. They're a massive asset for us.
And I mean, let's talk about Donald Trump, because it is this strange situation that we've faced. Obviously, Labour won a massive majority, and there was a bit of a cheer when that was mentioned in the introduction, but not as it wasn't huge because people are still slightly nervous because it does seem with Donald Trump and then with Nigel Farage over here, the right and the populist right specifically is making a lot of the running. It's that they seem to have the energy, and I wonder how you think the left responds to that. Does it try and beat them at their own game, or does it have to take a different approach, thinking, well, we're never going to be as crazy and exciting, wild and compelling as Donald Trump, and do something different? How do you respond to that kind of politics, which is different to what you've had to fight in the Conservatives?
It just shows you how much people are bounced along by the changing news media, because it's still only 6 months since we won that incredible general election victory with that huge landslide that 4 years earlier would have felt absolutely impossible. But it's only 6 months ago that we got that, and we have a 5-year term in government that we were elected to. We're only 6 months into it. If we can show visible change on the things that people elected us to do, if we can, the top one, stabilize the economy so we can get economic growth, so that we can give people a pay rise, so we can improve the public services people rely on in their own communities, and get the investment coming into high streets, clean up the rivers in my area. That was the really big one. People want visible proof points of change. If we do that, then I think we give ourselves the best possible chance of winning again at the next general election. What people don't want is hot air and no action. They won't believe words anymore. They want visible proof points of change.
And the stakes are quite high in that sense, because if you don't manage to do that, it's probably not going to be the pendulum swinging back towards traditional conservatism, isn't it? People are going to say, maybe this whole political system just isn't delivering for us, and we need something different.
Well, it's very hard to know 4.5 years out from the next general election. I don't think we should put too much weight on individual polls that come what might still be 4 years or more away from that general election. We just have to get on and do the things people elected us to do. That's what they're looking for. It's been very interesting going in to government. I'm sure for all of us that are in government now, after 14 years in opposition, in government now, going into government departments. There isn't going to be instant change, not on everything. There are some things we can do, and I referred to some in my area in that speech, but a lot of the big things are going to take more time. We've had to set a lot of commissions and reviews going so we can better understand how we build the route map to change. I've got a great team, but I only had 1 or 2 people working with me on policy development in opposition. Now we've got a department with 30,000 people, and you can do the more granular work that way. So we've set the direction of travel, we've said where we want to go and how we want to get there, but working out the detail of it, we're having to do in our departments. But I think Most people understand that. You know, knocking on doors in my own constituency or when I visit others, most people are reasonable. I think they'll give us time to show that we can make a difference as long as they understand and we communicate that we remain focused on the things that they voted for. That's why the plan for change appears in everything that we're talking about, because we want people to know we haven't forgotten why we were sent there and we are focused on getting delivery done in the way that people expected.
Okay, so let's sort of ask a little about your brief on the environment. And I want to start by asking about how you negotiate you might call it a tension between the environment and the fact that everyone in the government is very clear growth is the #1 mission. I mean, Rachel Reeves gave an interview to my colleague yesterday, and asking about bats or newts, and basically saying, neither really. I want to grow. I want to build things. You don't catch China doing long impact assessments. And some people look at that and think, well, hold on a second. Is this the trade-off we want? How do you negotiate that?
Well, first off, it's not either or. It's not growth or nature and the environment. We can do the two together. I mean, in opposition, the Tories tried, there were real issues around nutrient neutrality, which means waterways being already so full of pollution that any more house building around there will tip it over to a point of destruction where it might never recover. The Tories' approach to that was to weaken regulations and destroy nature. That's why I say that we're the conservatives now, not the Conservatives. They were destroying nature. Our approach is different. Our approach is to bring in that investment, clean up the waterways, change the way that farming happens so there's less runoff from agriculture as well as less sewage dumping from the water companies, clean up the waterways, then the house building can go ahead without having to weaken any of our environmental regulations. It's a very practical way that we can do things in a way that the Tories were just incapable of doing. And for the wider development that's going on, Angela Rayner is a fantastic ally in this. We both see things in exactly the same way. We want to speed up decision making so that development can go ahead. We've got a housing crisis. We need that housing for people to live in. But the developers will put money into a nature restoration fund, and that will pay for improvements in nature off-site, whether it's cleaning up water, cleaning the air, reforestation, creating new habitats, restoring precious landscapes like wetlands or peatlands that are under threat. So we end up, after that development, with more nature than we started with. It's quicker so that the growth can happen, but it's restoring nature at the same time. It genuinely is a win-win, and that is what will give us our direction in government as we move forwards.
And do you think the debate on the left particularly has moved on there? Because the kind of scheme you proposed, obviously you could see the advantages, you expressed them very well, but there was a time when many people on the left might have said, hold on a second, I don't want a government that allows big developers to basically pay to pollute. But it's quite striking there hasn't been any of that really, that kind of protest, certainly not from Labour MPs, the mainstream left this time. Do you think that the left has moved on and think we do have to find a way of doing both now because we've gone so long without growth that there is a new urgency about this?
I think people understand that we need to grow the economy if we're going to fund the public services that are all on their knees, and if we're going to give people the pay rise that they need, and if we're going to build the new homes that people need to live in, including council housing and social housing. My constituency advice surgery, at least half of everyone that comes to see me is living in overcrowded accommodation or accommodation that they can't afford to stay in, and they risk being evicted. Unless we build that council housing, social housing, affordable housing, we can't offer those people anything. I think, of course, the left wants to focus on social justice, but having families living in cramped single-room accommodation isn't social justice. We've got to get the house building done if we want to sort that out, and we've got to grow the economy if we want to give people jobs that pay a decent, more than a living wage. So I think it's accepted. Economic growth will provide the money to fund the public services and give people the pay rise they were denied underneath the Conservatives. Economic growth will provide the housing that we need, but we don't need to do it at the expense of nature. We can do these two things together if we plan it properly, and the Conservatives didn't. They just had a free-for-all. We're sitting down and working out how we make all of those things happen together, and it is a very different approach. But I think it's social justice, not only for people who need that additional support and rely on those public services, it's also justice for nature, which is in crisis, and this can be the turning point in nature's decline in these islands.
And let's just ask you about one very specific example, which the Prime Minister cites a lot when talking about this, which is the 100 million bat tunnel. For those of you who aren't familiar, I wrote a piece about it yesterday. I'd recommend it. But this is a tunnel along the route of HS2. It went past an ancient woodland, and they had to protect this particular type of bat. And so they spent years thinking of loads of different solutions, and the only one they come up with was this huge, long concrete tunnel, which cost £100 million, which, considering how many bats there are, is about 300 grand per bat. And what I found amazing about this was public body involved in this, felt that this was a terrible solution, but all of them also felt they had no option because of what the law was telling them to do. How do you avoid that kind of thing, and how would you handle that kind of situation better?
Well, the whole way that HS2 was managed under the previous government was absolutely chaotic. Had they worked out in advance what it was they wanted to protect and how they needed to protect it, they could have done it by a minor rerouting that would have cost far less. There was so little financial oversight that consultants were able to advise that they should be given more money to provide further consultancy services that ended up with £100 million being spent on a batshit that nobody, not even the environmental NGOs, nobody thinks is a good idea. I mean, that vast amount of money on a tunnel for bats when there are so many other public services crying out for funding, it's batshit crazy, really. And it happened because the previous government didn't have a grip on the finances, didn't have a grip on infrastructure projects, and didn't really have a grip on what was happening to nature either. Our approach is very, very different. So as we're looking at, people might have heard of the Environmental Improvement Plan. It's supposed to be the things that we, as a country, have agreed, the targets we're working towards to protect nature. But the previous government missed 94% of those targets because they didn't have delivery plans attached to them. We are working with the environmental NGOs, campaigners and other stakeholders to build those delivery plans in. And by bringing those groups in, who frankly know an awful lot more than I do about protecting and restoring nature, and having them work with the people that are looking at how we can grow the economy, we're going to get delivery plans that there's a good chance that we can actually deliver. So it's win-win again. Good growth, not wasting money in the way that it happened with that bat tunnel, but also protecting and restoring nature.
And from the ridiculous to the terrifying, I would ask about climate change and how this approach, you can apply that to climate change, because Rachel Reeves was very clear this week, economic growth trumps everything, and she said at Davos that, in a way that appeared to include net zero. And how do you resolve that tension, which is harder? Is there a way of applying that approach of mitigation and paying to offset here, that kind of thing, that has a slightly bad name when it comes to climate change? Can that approach be made to work for the biggest problem of all?
Well, the government's got a series of missions, and one of them is net zero. Of course, the overriding one is growth, but we will achieve that growth while also achieving our net zero targets in the same way that we are going to achieve the development that's going to drive the economy while also protecting and restoring nature. We need to stop seeing these things as intrinsically in opposition to each other, because there are ways to get both of them to work together in the way I was describing about food production or nature. They're not in opposition together, they work together, they have to work together, and we are putting forward hard proposals like the Nature Recovery Fund that will deliver that.
And to take an example, purely at random, how would that apply to something like the expansion of Heathrow, which you have opposed in the past? Is there a way of saying, look, if we are going to do this to get growth, we put in place conditions about aviation fuel or other offsets? You can say we are doing this in a way that respects our climate commitments.
Well, of course, it's speculation that you're talking about.
Very on message and politicians speak.
If you're talking about there, Chris, but if there were any proposal like that, then there would be a proper consultation, hopefully not lasting decades as it has done previously, because you don't have to take that amount of time to get to good decisions, but it would take into account all of those factors, mitigations, what we would need to do to make sure that it could work. And just out, since you mentioned my voting record on that one, I voted against expanding Heathrow last time because I was in favour of expanding Gatwick because it would provide economic growth that would benefit South London where my constituency is. So I see the link.
Very good. And it's good. Very, very clear. Non-politicians answer. I like that. Yeah. And then I want to ask you about sort of a question about the politics of the countryside, moving on slightly. Because I think last time I sat down and interviewed you, it was at a very nice pub out in Northamptonshire.
Yes,
it's when you were in opposition and you were trying to sort of win over the countryside and try and convince them that, Labour wasn't a sort of bunch of urbanites who didn't understand it and they weren't all, dare I say it, Fabian sitting in the middle of London talking about the future of the left. But you understand everyday life. And, then you come in and lots of farmers are now furious with you over, the changes to tax. So, I mean, you seem to be making progress in convincing them when we met. Have you blown it now?
Well, Labour's now the biggest party of rural Britain. Now, we've got 124 rural and semi-rural Labour MPs, all but 2 of them brand new, elected at the last general election. They are a very strong voice in the parliamentary Labour Party. I think about 30% of the entire parliamentary Labour Party now. So the Labour Party is the voice of rural Britain as well as the voice of urban Britain. We're also the voice of Scotland and we're the voice of Wales. We are the party that can represent every corner, every nook and cranny of this country, and that's very important if you want to be a national government. On farming, I saw the protests that happened down in London. You could see it going on from outside my office. I met with the president of the NFU, of course I did. I went down and I spoke to some of the farmers who had come to protest. And the thing that really struck me was it wasn't just about a tax change. On the front of some of those tractors or the placards that people were carrying were the words, "the final straw." Now, those straws have been building up for decades it's not just the farming community, but also rural Britain. They felt ignored, left behind, not taken into account when decisions are being taken. If you look at the things that rural Britain is most concerned about, it's exactly the same as all of the rest of Britain. The cost of living crisis comes first, the National Health Service comes second. They want the economy fixed, and they want their economy fixed. They want the health service fixed, and they want their GP and their hospital working properly for the local community again. They just felt they hadn't had that for so long. So the way that we connect with rural Britain is that politics of place again. There's no point talking about the percentage increase in funding for this or the percentage growth in the economy of that. What does it mean for my town? What does it mean for my village? How am I going to see a difference? It comes back to that politics of place. And I think that's what the last government got so badly wrong. I mean, they were letting all these services fall into collapse in any case. As we restore them, we have to show people restoring them in their area, not just use big strategies and big statistics.
And if you want to keep those dozens of rural MPs on quite narrow majorities sometimes, does that mean you're going to have to slow down on some of the other things that you promised that not everyone in the countryside is concerned about, like banning trail hunting and those other things that perhaps reinforce that sort of urban-rural opposition?
Well, we are committed to banning trail hunting because it's been used as a cover for hunting foxes, which is illegal. And the majority of people living in rural parts of Britain support the ban on trail hunting as well. When the hunting ban first came in, there was an agreement with the hunting community that if they used trail hunting to cover up fox hunting, then that would be banned. I'm afraid there's plenty of evidence that fox hunting continued. We will ban trail hunting.
And very clear. Again, non-politician's answer. And then, just finally, I suppose, to sum up, you talked a lot about the importance of telling stories and communicating with people in a way they understood. And I was speaking to a Labour MP, earlier in the week, who was quite gloomy. He's saying, look, we've done, as a government, loads of brilliant things. And when I sit down with people, they really get it. But when you speak to people over the media, they don't seem to hear it, they don't believe it, they don't understand it, whereas Nigel Farage said something about a cover-up and social media goes wild. And he's like, we haven't come up as a Labour Party with a coherent narrative that knits together things like fly tipping, economic growth, public services, and all those other things that beyond a shopping list to create a clear narrative. How do you start going about that? What is the story that knits it all together?
Yeah, it's our former General Secretary, David Evans, who told me politics is the art of competitive storytelling, because it's stories that connect with people emotionally, not statistics and not strategies. So we have to tell a story about Britain, about what it can become, and show people their place in it and their community's place and their families' place in it. Now, we need to get that story right. We need to get it better than it has been over the last 6 months. But, you know, we've all been very, very distracted for the right reasons, moving into departments, setting these strategies in place, starting to make that change happen. We need to remember we have to communicate it well, and we have to communicate it as part of a much bigger narrative that tells the British people where we're taking them so that they can see that Labour's story for Britain is their story for Britain. I think that gives us the best chance of winning the next election. But even within that, what they most want to see is visible proof points of change, and that is what we're focused on providing.
Thank you very much, everyone. Steve Reed, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thank you
you
very much.